Hello, everyone. Welcome to this side session on ending state-imposed forced labor and promoting decent work in cotton supply chains. This session is hosted by the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region and the Cotton Campaign. I'm Patricia Carrier, Business Engagement Lead with the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region. The coalition is made up of 400 organizations, including civil society, trade unions, and Uyghur groups from over 45 countries. We work to end state-imposed forced labor of the Uyghur and other Turkic and Muslim majority people in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, known to local people as East Turkestan, and which I will be referring to as the Uyghur Region. The coalition calls on brands to exit the region at every level of their supply chain, and this requires tracing supply chains down to raw material. And we've had success. You can see a list of brands who have committed to exiting the region on our website. With the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act now in effect in the US, we are calling on brands to apply a single global standard in line with the UFLPA requirements across their supply chains, regardless of where their products are sold. Our co-host, the Cotton Campaign, is a global coalition working to end forced labor and promote decent work for cotton workers in Central Asia. The campaign recorded a huge success last year in Uzbekistan, where after 15 years of intense policy and advocacy campaigning, the government ended the use of state-imposed forced labor in the harvest of cotton. In Turkmenistan, the campaign conducts supply chain research and uses the findings of independent labor monitors on the ground to advocate with brands, policymakers, and intergovernmental organizations to eliminate forced labor Turkmen cotton from global supply chains and increase the pressure on the government of Turkmenistan to reform its system. I first wanted to provide a bit of context and highlight why state-imposed forced labor demands very different action by companies than in other contexts. The ILO defines forced labor as work that is performed involuntarily and under the threat of penalty. What we are discussing today is forced labor, but what is unique about it is that it forms part of a state policy of widespread and systemic forced labor within repressive regimes where civil society and trade unions are unable to operate and are often punished. Within this context, companies are not able to undertake due diligence in line with the UNGPs or the OECD guidelines that they would normally undertake where forced labor is identified. Social audits or engagement with suppliers, for example, is not possible, and we'll hear more about this from our speakers. This is why we call for disengagement in these types of situations of state-imposed forced labor. In other contexts where forced labor is identified, we very much encourage and expect brands to engage and remediate. So with that context set, I wanted to provide an overview of today's discussion. We have an excellent panel of speakers who will discuss the use of state-imposed forced labor in cotton production in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and the Uyghur region, and how this tainted cotton enters the supply chains. We will also hear about the ongoing efforts being undertaken to ensure consumers are not inadvertently supporting state-imposed forced labor and ensure that companies do not continue to benefit from it, as well as for the need for brands to undertake human rights due diligence in a post-state-imposed forced labor context, such as Uzbekistan. I'm pleased now to introduce our panel of experts. We will first hear from Babur Ilchi, Uyghur activist and program manager at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, who will discuss Uyghur forced labor in that region. Next, we will hear from Ruslan Myatiev, director of Turkmen News. Ruslan is an exiled Turkmen journalist who will discuss his work with on-the-ground monitoring of forced labor in cotton production in Turkmenistan. Next, Raluca Dumitrescu, coordinator at the Cotton Campaign, who will discuss how state-imposed forced labor Turkmen cotton enters the supply chains and the work that led to the end of state-imposed forced labor in Uzbekistan. Next is Therese Randazzo, Forced Labor Division Director at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, who will provide insights on the regulatory efforts taken in the U.S. against such forced labor, such as forced labor import bans. And finally, we will hear from Hannah Bruce, Head of Global Partnerships at the Ethical Trading Initiative, who will discuss ETI's work with brands on this issue in the face of increasing regulatory and reputational risk. So a bit of housekeeping before we get started. I would encourage you to please introduce yourself with your affiliation in the chat. We will be using the Q&A function for any questions you might have. All attendees are muted, so please do use the Q&A if you have a question. Speakers will be answering questions throughout, but we will also have a Q&A session after the presentations. This session is being recorded, and we will share this along with any slides that are used today with registrants after the session. So without further ado, we can now get started. Babur, I will turn to you first. There's a system of abuse being perpetrated against Uyghur and other Turkic and Muslim majority people. Can you please address this, as well as the use of Uyghur forced labor in the production of cotton, and what you expect brands to do about this? Over to you.
Thanks, Patricia. Hi, everyone. I'm Babur Ilchi. I'm the program manager at Uyghur Human Rights Project, an advocacy, a research-based advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. So I wanted to first address the system of abuse and genocide that's happening in East Turkestan, also known as the Uyghur Region and called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region by China. But what we're seeing today is the mass detention of Uyghurs and other Turkic groups who are predominantly Muslim. Millions of Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples are sent to what are essentially these mass detention centers to undergo re-education, which includes hours of these classes, mental and physical torture, and in a lot of cases, sexual violence. There are survivors who can attest to that fact. These detentions are arbitrary, and something as simple as not drinking alcohol or attending a local mosque, having a beard, or keeping a Quran, or even contacting your relatives abroad can be enough to send you to these detention centers. Outside of these camps, life isn't much better, with the Chinese government using mass surveillance systems to monitor Uyghurs. A Human Rights Watch report detailed the integrated joint ops platform, which surveils Uyghurs and assigns them a risk level. Using their phone, their movements, and tracking them with a mass system of surveillance cameras, they can track the whereabouts of Uyghurs, determine where they're going, what they're doing, and at the same time, use this risk level system to arbitrarily detain them for what they perceive as a higher risk level. At this, notable intellectuals and cultural figures like Dr. Rahila Dawood or Yaqun Rozi, who are people who have participated in the education system or are prominent academics, are imprisoned, and women, Uyghur women, are sterilized, resulting in, at some places, a 50% drop in the birth rate in Uyghur dominant regions. This all falls under the Genocide Convention. Another massive component that we're here to talk about of the Uyghur genocide is forced labor, which puts nearly all the cotton from East Turkestan at risk of being forced labor goods. The Uyghur region produces 80% of the cotton in China, which is 20% of the world's cotton supply, which means that essentially all cotton in the supply chain is tainted with Uyghur forced labor. The XPCC, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, or Bingtuan, is a paramilitary force in the Uyghur region that is a primary driver of forced labor cotton production. This paramilitary organization is able to control, coerce, and force Uyghurs to pick cotton, harvest cotton, and sells it to apparel brands, to manufacturers, and it becomes tainted goods in the entire supply chain. And while many brands like Adidas and Hugo Boss claim that they have stopped using it, an isotopic test that happened just last year showed that these brands still have apparel with Uyghur cotton in them. So this is a lot more complex than just saying, oh, we're not using it, or that we're performing the proper due diligence, because due diligence is impossible in the Uyghur region. Workers cannot freely answer auditors. They're under constant coercion with themselves or their families under threat of detention, imprisonment, torture, or worse. And so they're not able to answer these auditors. And we see that major auditors have already left the region, citing the fact that you cannot freely audit in the system where state imposed forced labor is so deeply ingrained in the region. This nature of state-imposed forced labor prevents honest and accurate due diligence reporting, and as a result, brands must exit the Uyghur region completely. There's no safe way and there's no responsible way for these brands to continue to use Uyghur cotton or Uyghur labor. When we see the actions of the United States in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, we've seen that all goods that are made with Uyghur forced labor or in the Uyghur region are banned from entering the United States, which is a big step in curbing the profit incentive of Uyghur forced labor. But it's opened up other risks in the global market where countries like the EU, Canada, and the UK can become dumping grounds for forced labor goods, creating a two-tier supply chain where goods with forced labor go to those markets and a separate supply chain that has no Uyghur forced labor or no product or no resources or products from the Uyghur region entering the United States instead. And while countries like Canada already have forced labor legislation of some sort, and the EU has proposed a forced labor tool, these aren't enough in addressing the pervasive nature of state-imposed forced labor in the entire region. And what must be done is a region-wide ban. Otherwise, we risk continuing to create a profit incentive and an economic motive for the Chinese government to use Uyghur forced labor and to continue to profit from this genocide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Babur. And I would encourage the audience to refer to the Uyghur Human Rights Project website, as well as the coalition website for more extensive research on the system of repression that Babur has just set out for us. And I will note as well that the abuses that are happening in the Uyghur region have been found to possibly amount to crimes against humanity by both the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's also been found to be genocide by several countries, as well as a panel of independent legal experts here in the UK. So again, we're talking about a very pervasive system of abuse, of which forced labor forms a part of. Thank you very much for that, Babur. I'm going to turn it over to Ruslan next. You monitor the use of forced labor in Turkmenistan during the cotton picking season. I'd like to hand over to you to provide insights on the situation on the ground and the advocacy efforts, as well as challenges facing civil society while doing this monitoring. Over to you, Ruslan.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for joining. My name is Ruslan Myatiev. I'm a journalist from Turkmenistan, living and working in exile in the Netherlands. I'm the founder and editor of an independent media and human rights organization called Turkmen News. We promote freedom of speech and the rule of law in Turkmenistan, and besides publishing daily news, we investigate grant corruption and abuse of power, as well as raise cases of rights violations on various platforms like this one we have today. And I have a few slides to share. I'll switch off my camera and share my screen. Ladies and gentlemen, my key message to all of you today: if you source Turkmen cotton, yarn, or buy ready-made garments from Turkmenistan, you should stop immediately. And this is why you should do it. Every fall, from end of August until mid-December, the government of Turkmenistan forces tens of thousands of public sector workers to pick cotton. Teachers, nurses, doctors, bank and telecom employees, utility servicemen, and thousands of other civil servants across the country are taken to the cotton fields under different threats of punishment. It could be salary cuts, reduction of working hours, or even termination of employment. If one doesn't want to pick cotton himself, he must find a replacement or pay money to his supervisors to find one. In many cases, especially in the rural areas, people are taken to the cotton fields in the back of a truck or in a tractor trolley. Women are most vulnerable in the system of forced labor, as in Turkmenistan, it is mostly women who work as school teachers, kindergarten nannies, or as street cleaners. These are the most low-paid jobs in Turkmenistan, and that means that these women cannot afford hiring a replacement cotton picker. They either have to pick themselves or send their children in their place. And there are many children who pick cotton. Sometimes they pick cotton to earn some money to support their families, often to the detriment of their studies. Picking conditions are rough. People must gather at pickup points early every morning. Then somebody from the local administration does the head count. Then people board buses or trucks and travel for several hours to the cotton fields, and they work there all day. If the farmer is kind enough, he provides the pickers with water and maybe food, but otherwise people drink and eat whatever they brought with them, tea in a thermos and some bread. Similarly, if the farmer is kind enough, he will pay the pickers, attention, 2 American cents per kilogram of cotton that they submit. Otherwise, he reasonably argues that he never asked them to come over, that he doesn't need their help, and that he could pick his cotton himself. Later in the evening, the pickers are taken back home. Ladies and gentlemen, within our 10 years monitoring work, we have gathered terabytes of photos and videos from the fields, audio recordings from staff meetings, and other evidence of systemic government-orchestrated use of forced labor in Turkmenistan. Faced with tight deadlines and unrealistic cotton quotas, on those audio recordings, government officials demand more people are sent to the cotton fields. The government denies that there is forced labor issue in the cotton industry. Well, just to give you a bit of a context, Turkmenistan is one of the most closed and repressive countries in the world, very often compared to North Korea. There is no media freedom. There is no political opposition. All independent news reporters and labor rights monitors, they work undercover. If caught doing this work, they are given long prison terms on fabricated criminal charges. In prison, they face torture and their families become outcasts. The government is the major employer, and that, along with fear of reprisals, is another reason why people submit to the illegal cotton picking orders. In 2016, our labor rights monitor, Gaspar Matalayev, was imprisoned to 3 years on trumped-up charges. In the police, they tortured him with electric shocks to obtain cotton confessions. He served his sentence in full and was released in 2019 despite numerous international calls for his release. And as for media freedom, in 2020, our reporter Nurgeldi Khalikov was given 4 years in jail just for sending us the photograph of the World Health Organization mission that visited Turkmenistan to study its COVID preparedness. By the way, Turkmenistan denies that coronavirus made it into the country, despite dozens of fatal cases, including among foreign diplomats stationed in Ashgabat. I will stop here, but repeat it once again. Do not source cotton or cotton-made products from Turkmenistan. Please do not support slavery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruslan, and thank you for the work that you and other human rights defenders do, clearly at great risk. I'm sure there will be questions at the Q&A. So next, I would like to, we're going to hear more about how tainted cotton enters supply chains. So Raluca, the Cotton Campaign works to end state-imposed forced labor in the harvest of both Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, but you've done research into how tainted Turkmen cotton enters supply chains and how this poses a risk for brands. So I'll hand over to you to tell us about that research. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Patricia. And also, of course, thanks to our panelists for joining the webinar. And let me say how delighted I am that we're having our civil society partners joined by CBP and ETI in making a clear statement that the use of state-imposed forced labor is simply unacceptable in the supply chains of global brands and retailers. And similarly to Ruslan, I have also prepared slides, just a second, to share that. It's working, right? Just give me a hands up. Yeah. Okay, thanks. So very briefly, Patricia already provided an introduction about the cotton campaign, and I won't stay on this too long. I just wanted to say that, on this call specifically, although we work on both Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, I'll focus on Turkmenistan, and I'm happy to address the current situation we're seeing in Uzbekistan in the Q&A session if people are interested. So I just wanted you to see here on the left side of this slide, some of our members, which you may recognize from different spaces, ranging from brand engagement to policy advocacy and empowerment of workers and trade unions. And we're all very happy that our coalition is so diverse and strong. And specifically, as it relates to our work on Turkmenistan, I want to be very clear that we are calling for full transparency and full traceability of the cotton supply chains. And we're also hosting a pledge in which over 140 companies so far have committed to not use Turkmen cotton as long as it's made with state-imposed forced labor. So as Ruslan showed earlier, Turkmenistan continues to use systematic government-controlled forced labor to harvest cotton. And this is obviously immoral and in violation of ILO and human rights standards and conventions, and no one is denying that. But the fact that Turkmen cotton enters the global markets means that actually also the brands that are selling products made with Turkmen cotton and the governments allowing for this to happen benefit from forced labor. So I'm going to show you during my presentation what our research says about the ways in which Turkmen cotton enters the global supply chains so that all actors can take action and eliminate it. And here on this slide, you can see a visualization of the cotton supply chain. I think it's really important to understand these stages, not just for brands, but also for policymakers and law enforcement, because this is really critical to understanding why full traceability and transparency of supply chains are urgently needed. So here you can see 5 tiers of production. They are showing the production of cotton from the farm level all through to the finished apparel and textile products. And of course, please note that this is obviously a simplified visualization because we often have traders in between tiers, right? And also cotton products are aggregated at different stages of production. So a fabric mill, as some of you may know, for example, is probably using yarn coming from over a dozen spinning mills. So for everyone to know, Turkmenistan exports all types of cotton products, all the way from raw cotton to finished goods. But in my presentation moving forward, I will focus specifically on imports of yarn and fabric from Turkmenistan, because this is where we're seeing a high risk for brands that Turkmen cotton enters their supply chains. So this slide shows that Turkmen cotton yarn enters third countries where it is processed into fabric and finished goods. So you can see here in this box, the top 3 importers of Turkmen cotton in 2021 were Turkey, Russia, and China. And like I mentioned earlier, Turkmenistan also exports large quantities of fabric that is then processed into apparel and home textiles. And Turkey is again the top importer, followed by Morocco, Italy, and Portugal. So very briefly, just a few conclusions based on what these import trade data are showing us. First, it's clear that European countries use forced labor Turkmen cotton in the production of garments and home textiles. And here you can see names such as Portugal, Italy, and Poland, among others, who are importing yarn and fabric from Turkmenistan. So this shows that the brand supply chains, even the European supply chains, are at risk. And this is also very critical information, especially now, as Babur mentioned, at the EU level, policymakers are discussing a proposal for a forced labor instrument, and it's crucial that they make sure that all cotton originating in Turkmenistan is banned from entering the EU at any level of the supply chain. Now, this data also shows us that China imports yarn from Turkmenistan. So with China, we know already that 90% of the cotton produced there is made with Uyghur forced labor. So brands must ensure that their suppliers in China have no ties to the Uyghur region and do not benefit from the forced labor system there. But at the same time, the brands must also ensure that even if they work in China with suppliers that say they only use imported cotton products, full traceability is mandatory to make sure that there is no cotton from Turkmenistan. And third, the third key point here is that Turkey is the top importer of Turkmen cotton semi-finished products, which you already saw on the previous slides. And let me say that, I fully realize that Turkey is going through a horrendous tragedy at the moment. And obviously the textile industry has suffered a huge shock. Our thoughts are with the victims and the country moving forward towards recovery. I just want to make sure that everybody's aware. I'm actually raising Turkey as a case study here because it's been importing all types of Turkmen cotton products and the volumes are increasing. So I already mentioned, the imports of yarn and fabric into Turkey, but also look on this slide at the values for imports of raw cotton. So by comparing import data from 2020 with data from 2021, we realized that the quantity of Turkmen cotton imported into Turkey increased 5-fold in only 1 year. So this basically increases the risk for brands that their products made in Turkey are tainted by Turkmen forced labor. And also Turkey is the third largest textile supplier to the EU, which obviously puts the brands retailing in the EU at high risk. And finally, here in the right bottom corner, you can see that based on information made available through the Open Supply Hub, which again, we all know it's not exhaustive because not all the brands are publishing their suppliers. There are over 20,000 facilities in Turkey that participate in the global brands textile supply chains. So to conclude, based on what Ruslan has said earlier and what I have just presented, there are 2 key points here for brands and policymakers. First, they must acknowledge that all cotton from Turkmenistan is produced in a government-controlled, systematic forced labor system. And because the government maintains total control of cotton production, brands and retailers simply cannot prevent or remediate forced labor in the country. And the second point, obviously, like I have just shown you, Turkmen cotton enters the global supply chains at different stages and tiers of production. So knowing this, we are urging brands and retailers to take the actions listed on this slide. And we are also urging governments to implement policies and legislation requiring brands to take these actions to make sure that there is no forced labor Turkmen cotton in our global supply chains. So first and foremost, there's an urgent need for mapping supply chains to the raw material level and excluding cotton from Turkmenistan. Brands must establish a binding policy that prohibits the use of Turkmen cotton. They must communicate the policy to their suppliers and must also verify compliance with the policy in their supply chain. And very important, and I'm hoping that brands watching us right now already know that, in the US, there is already a withhold release order, so an import ban against Turkmen cotton. And now with the UFLPA entering into force last year, companies are required to map their supply chains to the raw material level to exclude all goods made in whole or in part in the Xinjiang region. So we are urging brands to use this opportunity to also trace and eliminate Turkmen cotton from their products at all stages of production. So that's it from me now. I look forward to hearing from the other panelists about their work to eliminate forced labor Turkmen and Uyghur cotton from supply chains. So I'll pass it to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Raluca. Thank you for that clear and comprehensive case study and for highlighting the need for full traceability to ensure brands are avoiding using tainted cotton in their products. And I'll just pause here to say thank you to all the speakers so far for making very clear demands and expectations. And I'm sure this is useful for brands as well. So Therese, I'm going to now move over to you. We are very fortunate to have you here today, as Raluca has already expressed, to discuss how the U.S. government is addressing the issue of state-imposed forced labor. Can you please tell us more about the government's approach and the requirements that this places on brands? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, and hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak a little bit today about what the U.S. is doing in forced labor, and particularly as regards to state-sponsored forced labor. So we have in the United States had since the 1930s actually an ability to prevent the importation of goods made with forced labor. However, that law was not very well enforced until recently because it had a loophole in it that allowed goods that were not produced in sufficient quantity in the United States to meet demand to be imported. So it was primarily an economic perspective. That has changed in recent years, beginning particularly with the passage of the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act in 2015. That law repealed the clause in our law that had allowed that loophole in our law that had allowed the importation of goods made with forced labor. And so now CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the border authority in the United States, has authority to stop importation of goods made with forced labor, regardless of whether there's enough production in the United States to meet demand. So it is really a shift to the focus on the human rights and the use of forced labor, and that is unacceptable, regardless of the economic situation. So that was further, our ability to take action against state-sponsored forced labor was further strengthened in last year in December of 2021, when the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed the US Congress. And just to give you a sense of how important this is in the United States and how big of an issue it is, our Congress rarely agrees on anything, but the Uyghur Act passed the Senate unanimously, and it passed the House of Representatives by a vote of 428-1, which indicates the strong bipartisan support in the U.S. government for taking action against state-sponsored forced labor. Going further with that, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which I will refer to as the UFOPA, that's what we call it in the U.S., it required an interagency task force, so agencies across the U.S. government to participate in the development of a strategy to support the implementation of the UFOPA and to support CBP's implementation of that law's rebuttable presumption that any goods made wholly or in part in the Xinjiang region of China or by entities that were added by that group to the entity list are made with forced labor and are prohibited from entry into the United States unless the importer can meet certain conditions. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later. It's a very high bar. So we have agencies across the United States working to prevent importation of goods made with forced labor through the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. I'll also flag that that law required Treasury to create, required state to create a diplomatic strategy pertaining to forced labor in the Uyghur region, and to work with foreign partners, foreign governments towards strengthening restrictions on use of products, use of forced labor in the production of products. The law also requires Treasury to impose sanctions on Chinese entities and others that use Uyghur forced labor. So as was mentioned already by Raluca, we do have a withhold release order on Turkmenistan cotton. The withhold release order is the primary mechanism by which CBP takes action against goods made with forced labor. And we did issue a withhold release order on Turkmenistan cotton in May of 2018 that applies to cotton produced in Turkmenistan and all downstream products that are made with that cotton. In 2021, we took action against the Xinjiang and against Uyghur forced labor with the issuance of a withhold release order on cotton and cotton products produced in the Xinjiang region of China, and all downstream products that incorporate those products as inputs. That withhold release order has now been superseded by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So it's streamlined our ability to take enforcement actions against Xinjiang cotton and against parties that use Xinjiang cotton. And so the UFOPA established a rebuttable presumption, as I mentioned, that goods made wholly or in part with Xinjiang cotton or by entities on the entity list use forced labor. And so we no longer have to do any sort of investigation or take any other, we can just detain those goods and require the importer to establish that they were not made with forced labor or they're not allowed to enter the U.S. commerce. Our enforcement actions and the recognition of the financial, legal, and reputational risks that accrue to importers by using cotton produced in the Xinjiang or using cotton produced in Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan have resulted in changes, positive changes. We are seeing importers shift their supply chains away from the Xinjiang in particular, and they've moved production in many cases to third countries. For example, I'll use Vietnam as an example here, where we've seen a shift in supply chains from production in China to production for cotton and apparel and textiles to Vietnam. This is a very positive step because we are trying to, we need to get out, the companies need to get out of the Xinjiang. However, this remains a challenge for brands because the category of high-risk goods includes not only goods that originate in the Xinjiang or from entities on the entity list, but it includes any goods that are produced wholly in part by entities that have operations in the Xinjiang. So even if they're located in other parts of China, they're located in other countries, if they have operations in the Xinjiang, CBP considers that to be a high-risk transaction, a high-risk supply chain. We also look at the parent subsidiaries and affiliates of these entities as high risk as well. We apply the rebuttable presumption to downstream products that are produced in third countries that incorporate any of these goods produced by any of these entities as inputs. And we also look at goods that are just shipped through third countries that may contain cotton from the Xinjiang or from produced by entities in the entities list. So this is a very comprehensive list of products that are potentially falling within the scope of the UFOPA's rebuttable presumption. What this means is that the supply chains, that the shipping of supply chains to Vietnam does not fully solve the problem for brands because their supply chains remain at higher risk. As Babur said, 80% of Chinese cotton is from the Xinjiang. Vietnam imports cotton yarn and cotton fabric from China. And there's also the issue with the commingling of the cotton during production processes that's been highlighted already. So there's a high risk that products produced in Vietnam may still contain Xinjiang cotton. So those goods are subject to enforcement action by CBP. So as you can imagine, looking at that universe of products, this is a challenge for law enforcement because we can't simply just stop all goods that might contain cotton that are coming from Vietnam to determine whether or not they might contain cotton produced with forced labor. So we have to take a risk-based approach. So we do employ a dynamic and risk-based approach to enforcement that relies on the current data and information that we have available to us, and we use that to take action to prevent prohibited goods from entering the U.S. That information includes our own data as well as other information available to us through private sector databases and other sources that provide visibility into supply chains. Although we have tools and data to do that, this is still a challenge for law enforcement because we lack full visibility into supply chains, and there are a number of technological projects and work being done to improve that visibility. I'm not able to get into specific details on all of the information that we use or some of the technology that we use because sharing that type of information then opens up the risk of circumvention by parties who are not committed to removal of forced labor from their supply chains, and we do encounter entities like that. So we detain goods that are in high risk shipments that we identify, and we do not allow those goods to enter the United States unless the importer is able to demonstrate that those goods are admissible. That is very difficult. The UFOPA sets forward requirements the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, the interagency group that developed the UFOPAS strategy, enforcement strategy, was required by law to provide guidance for importers on if they wanted to seek an exception to the rebuttable presumption. That guidance requires importers to exercise due diligence. It requires them to map their supply chains. It requires them to implement supply chain measures, and it requires them to provide evidence that the goods were not made with forced labor. Given the conditions on the ground that Babur described in the Xinjiang, it is virtually impossible to meet the due diligence requirements. The strategy actually notes that and puts importers on alert that that's probably going to be the case. The evidentiary standard for overcoming that presumption is clear and convincing evidence. That is a very high bar. To date, we have yet to have any importers of cotton products even attempt to try to overcome that the UFOPAS rebuttable presumption. But as has been noted, while the U.S. has taken action here, we alone cannot stop the China's use of forced labor in the Xinjiang. We cannot stop Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan use of forced labor. The point of our forced labor statutes really is not stopping goods made from entering the United States, but stopping them from being made with forced labor in the first place. And so while we are seeing businesses modify their behavior and implement social compliance programs and increasing due diligence in order to maintain access to the U.S. marketplace, that's not enough. That needs to be done on a global scale to prevent the goods that are not admissible into the United States from entering other markets. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is a step in the right direction there and presents a potential model for free trade agreements that would prevent importation of goods made with forced labor. The USMCA does contain a requirement that U.S., Canada, an item for Canada and Mexico that implement a prohibition on the importation of goods made with forced labor. Region where products made with forced labor are not allowed. Canada has implemented that law. Mexico is from what we understand, is in the process of moving forward on that law. But then, of course, there is the issue. We are working with them towards improving their ability then to enforce those laws. While the U.S. and CBP are global leaders in forced labor enforcement when it comes to the importation of goods made with forced labor, and we have garnered a lot of attention and awareness of state-sponsored forced labor and forced labor more broadly, and CBP is why I will note is one of the only customs agencies in the world with legal authority to prevent goods made with forced labor from entering domestic commerce. We do need to see that type of action by governments more broadly around the world. Legislation followed by enforcement action is crucial to ending state-sponsored forced labor and the ability to profit from that.
Thank you so much for that, Therese. You've raised so many excellent points. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions around enforcement, what's covered, what isn't, although you've been quite detailed now in your presentation. And just to note, as has already been said by Babur, the UFLPA, as we refer to it, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, has been a great step forward in the advocacy movement on Uyghur forced labor. And we are, as a coalition and many of our member organizations, actively advocating for similar measures in other jurisdictions, especially as we really try to raise awareness that brands may be creating clean supply chains for the US market and then tainted supply chains for other markets. So we really want to avoid that dumping ground. Also, just to highlight your point on the importance of import data, we need more countries providing that publicly in order to trace and track these shipments, especially those that might be coming from third countries. Yeah, so I guess I'll leave it there, but thank you so much. And I already see questions coming in, so I'm sure we'll get back to you soon. Next, I want to hear from Hannah. So thank you, Hannah, for being here today. The ETI works closely with brands, and I wondered if you could share challenges that your members are facing in meeting their increasing legal obligations under not just the UFLPA, but also due diligence laws and other types of import bans that do require full traceability of their supply chains, and perhaps speak a bit about just efforts more generally to address state imposed forced labor. Over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for having me, and really appreciate the opportunity to be able to join this panel today. So as you've indicated, Patricia, Ethical Trading Initiative is an alliance of businesses, NGOs and trade unions, and we've been working with our collective membership for some time to understand the complexity of issues and also be able to provide appropriate guidance and support to the broader membership. So that's been seen through the development of things such as briefings on state-imposed forced labour, being able to produce and update statements and recommendations on the situations that we see emerging, and also be able to provide a space for ongoing dialogue and collaborative exchanges with members and experts in this field. As we've heard today, the evidence that we've heard is very compelling. The data that's presented by the ILO indicates that 14% of the 27.6 million in forced labour are in state-imposed forced labour. And we've seen a lot of detail emerging from various different reports over the period of time. So we appreciate the context and the dynamics are complex, and the ETI broadly is guided by and encourages our members to consider the application of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights when faced with such complexities such as this. The UNGPs highlight that businesses have an obligation to ensure that they do not cause or contribute to human rights abuses, but also governments have a primary responsibility to prevent such abuses. So in the situation of state-imposed forced labour, there's a limit to the ability that businesses to bring about positive change, although this should not diminish the need to ensure that businesses fully honour their responsibility to protect human rights in their supply chains. There's various different principles and components under the UNGPs that are worthwhile looking at, but in particular, Principle 23 acknowledges that companies operate in different jurisdictions and in complex contexts. And it states under the Principle 23 that in all contexts, business enterprises should ensure that they comply with all applicable laws and respect internationally recognized human rights wherever they operate. It also points out that businesses need to treat the risk of causing or contributing to gross human rights abuses as a legal compliance issue wherever they operate. It further goes on to provide commentary with regards to the fact that where the domestic context renders it impossible to meet the responsibility to respect human rights fully, business enterprises are expected to respect the principles of internationally recognized human rights to the greatest extent possible, and in the circumstances to be able to demonstrate their efforts in this regard. So we see that, you know, there is much more effort needed within businesses to have a deep understanding of the sourcing context, the culture, the governance, and the economic policies that surround it. For example, in China, we've seen and we've heard that, particularly in relation to Xinjiang, we know that it's important to also understand the context within that, but it's also important to be able to look beyond that as well. As we know that there are various different policies that drive kind of the use of forced labour across the country as well. So, for example, with regards to the economic policies that exist around reduction of poverty, as it's been called, and then also around labour transfer scheme to other regions in China. It's therefore important to look, for example, in the case of China and elsewhere, to understand how you can rely on a combination of different resources and information to be able to paint that bigger picture. So looking at, for example, NGO independent expert reports, international media investigations, looking at local media reports, and being able to think about what additional documentation from regional and local governments, for example, are needed. Overall, this basically demonstrates that businesses are having to expand their in-house expertise much more beyond what it has been previously. So what efforts have we seen being adopted? It can be quite broad-ranging. This is often dependent on resources, the approach, and the knowledge of an individual organisation. But we know that, for example, it can range from taking a very sensitive approach with suppliers to try and understand and understand the impact that's being had within their own businesses, and being able to have those conversations, and being able to provide training and capacity building to suppliers. It also involves things such as looking much deeper into the supply chain. So really trying to map and understand supply chains to tier 3 and beyond, and also using contractual provisions to be able to require due diligence of others further down the supply chain. Where their resources exist, we also see that genetic things of use of such as genetic tracing of cotton products and other things are being used. Importantly, there's a lot of capacity building, particularly of internal teams, including commercial and sourcing, to understand the challenges, and this includes considering how one's own business practices can either exacerbate or influence a particular situation. And importantly, we know that taking joint action and engaging in partnership on the issue is important. So, for example, engaging with others like the Call to Action and other expert groups. There's a range of other measures that can be taken, such as using innovative techniques to conduct human rights assessments, media scraping and assessments. But ultimately, this is all about creating a much deeper understanding of what's going on. The use of needing to address subcontracting and the complexity of supply chains is also something that we've seen. And thinking about how businesses can increase their leverage as well, not just within business communities, and with other kind of such as industry associations, but also how they can engage a bit more strategically on an advocacy front with government agencies and others organisations, and thinking about how they can do that behind the scenes, but also publicly as well. With regards to the reduction of supply chains and reducing the complexity of it, we see that as has already been indicated, there is a significant shift of supply out of China. This has been due to a combination of geopolitical tensions, the Trump trade war, prolonged COVID-19 policies, the rising cost of production, and the risk that we see and to business as well and to workers. So that we've seen that there's been a steady move, as already been mentioned, into Bangladesh, Vietnam, and China's share of the global export consumer goods has been declining since 2016. But as already been indicated, cotton, especially that produced in high-risk situations, can still make its way into new production locations. So we see, for example, that Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Turkey still sit within the top 4 countries importing cotton from China, while China, India, and the US remain the top production countries. It's also interesting to note that China limits imports of cotton by a quota and encourages textile manufacturers to purchase cotton from the West. Nevertheless, a research report recently published by the US Department of Agriculture indicated that approximately around 1,500 textile manufacturers applied for a share of the import quota between 2016 and 2022, thereby demonstrating their strong interest to source more imported cotton. We can all make our assumptions as to why that case may be. Just to conclude very quickly, so we see companies are needing to think about how they act together and in cooperation with others, informed experts, and by using this network of stakeholders to weigh up the evidence and determine the appropriate response that is required by their own individual companies. Transparency in this process is essential, and ultimately companies can be held liable for perpetrating forced labour by benefiting from it. So they have a duty to protect and respect fundamental human rights across their supply chains. If buyers do choose to stay engaged in jurisdictions where there's adverse human rights impacts, there'll be a need to be able to demonstrate their ongoing efforts to mitigate human rights impacts. and be prepared to accept the consequences that surround this, be that reputational, financial, or legal. I look forward to the further conversation.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We're quickly approaching the hour. All these presentations have been fantastic. We have been capturing the questions in the Q&A, so thank you for sending those. I would encourage our speakers to answer any of those that are relevant to them. I'm going to throw one out there just quickly, see if we can get some answers. And also to note, my colleague will be putting email addresses for both the Cotton Campaign and the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor, should anyone, especially brands, want to get in touch and learn more about our work. So there's a question here that says, can brands completely eliminate forced labor cotton from their supply chains? And are there examples of this we can lean on? I'm going to hand that over to Ruslan, if you don't mind, if you're okay with that.
I didn't expect that. I would have answered the question in the chat room. Well, I think it's, of course, it's going to be difficult. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of human resources, financial resources to trace all the way down to the lowest tier where the cotton comes from. But I can only tell about my hopes and feelings. I think companies should be doing that because we're living already, you know, in the 21st century. It's 2023 outside, and it is just so not acceptable that when we see a few years ago, for example, I could go to one of the big names here in the Netherlands, and I'm sure it was everywhere where that company worked, and I could buy bed linen, and which would clearly say made in Turkmenistan. You know, then we went to that brand and we told them that, look, there is a big issue with forced labor in Turkmenistan. You shouldn't be doing that. We ultimately convinced them to publicly say that, okay, we're stopping any relationships with Turkmenistan because we cannot independently verify that there is no forced labor in the country. So companies should be doing, they should be striving, you know, to complete that supply chain research all the way to the bottom. And I hope that they will do it. We from our side are, you know, providing any information necessary. We meet with politicians, with policymakers, and we are telling them we're trying to advocate for relevant laws. The European Union is soon will be considering such laws, and we're working closely with all different stakeholders on that level to push for this idea, to make companies, to oblige them to dive deeper and trace all the way down.
Thank you for that, Ruslan. Raluca, I see you have your hand raised.
Thanks. I just wanted to add quickly, because I know we're short on time, but I wanted to bring in the discussion the context of Uzbekistan, because it was mentioned also in a few of the questions we have received. And first, someone is asking, how effective do you think these sanctions could be? For example, if you ban a certain product produced with forced labor in Turkmenistan or Xinjiang, isn't the government going to force people to do something else? And I can tell you that actually that's not how it works from our experience. So for Uzbekistan, the Cotton Campaign has advocated for over 15 years for the government to end state-imposed forced labor in cotton. And eventually they did it. It worked. It was a very long period, tedious period. We used all the tools available, from advocacy to engaging with the brands, and the pressure worked on the government. And they actually reformed the whole forced labor system. So in the beginning, they were forcing, similarly to Turkmenistan, doctors, teachers, students to harvest cotton. Now that's not happening anymore, right? The teachers are teaching and the doctors no longer need to leave their jobs in the hospitals to pick cotton. It's people that are actually looking for cash that want to do that because they want to voluntarily, and it's seen as a good way to earn money for during the harvest period, those three months. So that worked. It also reminds us why we're doing all this stuff, right? Like, it's first, we want to make sure our supply chains are free of forced labor, but what's the ultimate goal is to actually make sure these governments no longer force people to harvest cotton and to produce other raw materials. And I also want to make quickly the difference between what we're calling for. So there's two things here. There's the context where the government controls the system and it's state-imposed forced labor, and the only thing brands can do is trace their supply chains and completely eliminate that. And then there are contexts in which the government does not control that, but there are still risks of forced labor, like what we're seeing now in Uzbekistan. The situation is not fully remediated, the risk remains, and in other contexts too. Then we're calling for brands, if they are already there, they need to stay there and they need to remediate the situation, and they need to engage with workers, independent worker representatives, unions, to find a solution and address the root causes of forced labor. So we know that, you know, social audits, certifications have simply failed time and again to identify forced labor and to remediate that in those kinds of contexts, right? So in the first example, you really need traceability and eliminate Xinjiang cotton and Turkmen cotton. In the second example, you need a robust labor component attached to any solution you find for traceability. And I'll stop there because there's a lot of questions addressed to Therese, so she can take over.
Yes, there are, Therese. There are lots of questions for you, including how often the entity list will be updated. And I think a good one is, what pushback is there from companies and industry bodies? Because I think that's also important as well, that sort of pushback on these types of stringent and robust mechanisms.
So with regard to updating the entity list, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force is currently working on an update to the entity list. I don't think it's not on a particularly set schedule, but they do have an obligation to update that list and add new entities to that. They've been focused on getting the processes in place and procedures in place to do that. We went very quickly from the enactment of the UFOPA to the actual implementation of the UFOPA. So there's still some of that sort of process work that is ongoing. And so, but we do expect that an update to the entity list to be coming shortly. There is further information available online on the Department of Homeland Security's website, as well as in the Federal Register, regarding how that will be accomplished. For those of you that are interested in looking further into that. The second question on pushback, it's an interesting question, because I think that most companies want to do the right thing and they don't want to use forced labor in their supply chains. And many of them believe they have done sufficient due diligence and they're not using forced labor. But as has been pointed out, as a practical matter, it's difficult to impossible to do adequate due diligence, for example, in the Xinjiang, or in other places where you have state-sponsored forced labor. It's almost impossible to do adequate due diligence, from my perspective, in China in general. And so that is the challenge, there are challenges there. And so companies that feel that they are moved out of those regions and have taken appropriate steps are still, the issue is when CBP is still, because remember the wide scope of products that I talked about that could potentially be subject, for example, to the UFOPA's rebuttable presumption. And so when CBP detains goods that we believe may fall within that scope, that the main pushback we're getting from companies is, the detention of those goods and the requirement for them to demonstrate that those goods were not sourced from the Xinjiang or not sourced from entities on the entity list, and that requires them to trace, for cotton, the supply chain all the way back to the cotton bale level. And getting that documentation and doing that, it is a lot of effort to trace that supply chain and show all those parties that are in it, and to establish that this is in fact the supply chain, and to document that the transactions that they're stating occurred between parties in the supply chain actually did occur, and that this is the actual production process, and this is the actual cotton that was used. So in many cases, they note that, well, we used a U.S. cotton to produce this product, but you have to show that that is the cotton that was actually used in the production of the product, that it was not commingled during production with Xinjiang cotton, et cetera. And so most of the pushback that we're seeing is in that area there, in terms of the requirements to demonstrate that you've mapped that supply chain and you've done your due diligence and that supply chain is clean. And we appreciate that that is a difficult process because it's also very labor intensive for the agency to review that information. But that's the main area where I think we're seeing that pushback from companies. It's not that they want to use forced labor, at least in the cotton space. In other industries, a little bit different because we are seeing supply chains that are saying we're bifurcating our supply chain and we are shipping goods to the United States that are not made with forced labor, but we are shipping goods made to other parts of the world that in fact do use goods produced and use products produced in the Xinjiang, for example.
Thank you for that. We are past the hour. I'm sorry that we have to end this discussion, but I do realize people have calendars to keep to. So I just want to close by saying a big thank you to our panelists for a very informative discussion on a subject I don't think we hear enough about. And I think this is proven by the questions that we have in the Q&A. And also for highlighting the importance of brands to map their supply chains and ensure they're not benefiting or supporting these brutal and repressive state-imposed forced labor regimes. Again, I think thank you, Ruslan, you've added your contact information in the chat. I would encourage everyone to get in touch if you have further questions. We will share the questions that were provided or that were shared in the Q&A and try and get answers back to registrants who've attended. But from me and from the panel, I would just like to say thank you for attending our session today, and hopefully we can continue this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.